What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and in this video we're going to be doing another discussion video. Now, the topic of the discussion I've been thinking about for quite some time through exploring Cyber format, which is the latest format that I've been covering on the channel. It took place in September 2005 using the GOAT format ban list, along with cards going up to Cybernetic Revolution. So that includes things like Xarian Universe, Cyber Dragon, and most importantly, for the topic of this discussion, Cyber End Dragon and Cyber Twin Dragon. Now, Cyber Twin Dragon and Cyber End Dragon were both very, very powerful OTK enablers with Cyber-Stein. You use Cyber-Stein, bring out a 4,000 attack point monster that can pierce through an opponent's set monster. You've also got this 2,800 attack point monster that can attack twice. And if you combine it with something like limit removal, or if you bring out like a monarch and use Last Will to bring the Cyber-Stein out of the deck, then you can easily get to 8,000 damage very, very quickly, basically out of nowhere. Now, for a lot of people, the formats where those Stein OTK decks are viable are not that fun, because basically, you know, if they draw very, very well, they can just basically win the game on the spot, like, you know, just going for a Trunade and then going for a big play that just wipes through your defenses and leaves you with nothing that you can actually do to interact with that. And some people don't really like that style of gameplay. So, you know, I understand why a lot of people avoid formats like Cyber or Reaper, etc. But the question then becomes, are these Stein decks actually the best decks in the format, or are they just very, very good? And the fact that they're very good warps the format around them. So let me explain, because I've been talking about Cyber-Stein decks in my Cyber format coverage, and I've been saying like Stein decks are everywhere and they're the best deck in the room, or a lot of people view them that way. But if you look at past tournament results for Cyber format, you see things like Warrior winning. You see things like, you know, just other decks that aren't quite Cyber-Stein OTK oriented. And that also makes sense, because if you've got a big tournament, over the course of those rounds, you're not going to be able to pull off the Stein OTK every single time. And sometimes you will brick on things. Like, let's say you're playing a big Last Will package, bring out your Cyber-Stein. You could potentially brick on the Wills. You could potentially brick on Steins with no way to clear your opponent's defenses. You know, there are a lot of different things that could happen with the Cyber-Stein deck that causes it to lose. Just like there are a lot of things that can happen with the Cyber-Stein deck that can allow it to win out of nowhere. So there are a lot of different, you know, circumstances that go into a Stein deck being successful or not successful, and it's very, very high variance, which means that, you know, when it wins, it just blows out the opponent. When it loses, there's just nothing you can really do to turn the game around, right? And of course, I'm not trying to say that Stein decks are like no skill, because I do think that Stein decks are actually very skillful. Like, knowing when to go for your Stein OTK pushes, even when the opponent potentially has defenses up, is a very, very skillful thing to decide. And you've got to factor a lot of things into going for that sort of play. You've also got to factor, like, okay, you know, in case where I can't OTK this turn, do I do Stein to bring out another fuse monster besides something like Cyber Twin or Cyber End? And will that be good enough to, you know, last me for the rest of the game? And there are a lot of different, you know, questions like that you have to consider when playing those Stein decks, and that's part of why I enjoy playing Stein decks like that. But, you know, I'm not here to talk about the experience playing Stein itself, really. I'm really here to talk about the experience playing against Stein. And you could say that, like, well, the fact that Cyber format has some other decks winning these tournaments doesn't really matter that much, because the tournaments are largely, you know, pretty small, right? Like, I don't really think there have been many that have gotten, like, above 20 people playing. So, you know, realistically, like, and I'm not really including like way, way back in the day when SJC Boston was held for this tournament, because, like, you know, I'm talking about in retrospect, because oftentimes in exploring these formats in retrospect, you will find new ways to refine the decks down, make them more consistent. And Stein's one of the decks that I think it's definitely benefited from hindsight, because in a lot of the early days of these formats, people weren't really as on Stein as they are now, or they're playing in different ways. So I do think that, you know, for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to limit it to just modern retro exploration of these formats, and frankly, Cyber format has not had much of that. However, there's a format very similar to Cyber format that actually has had a fair amount of exploration, and that is Reaper format. Reaper format is the format that takes place right after Cyber format that was popularized by MBT, because when he and Simo got to it on the History of Yu-Gi-Oh series, he really liked it, and he was like, this is actually a good format. Like, let's play more of it, let's dive in and, you know, see what comes of it, right? And so a lot of people, you know, flooded into the Reaper Discord server, and a lot of games happened in that server, and a lot of tournaments happened in that server with a ton of people. So you have these tournaments for Reaper with big, big numbers, and a lot of people playing a lot of different decks. And I'm pretty sure, even though Stein is very, very powerful in that format, I combed through a lot of the older Reaper format tournament results, and I didn't see Stein winning tournaments. It definitely topped a lot, And, I myself have even topped with a Stein variant in that format. I didn't make it that far in the top cut, but I did make it a top cut. But, they couldn't quite convert to a win. And so that makes you wonder, okay, well, are Cyber-Stein decks actually not the best deck in the format, even though they are so dominant? And I think that that is a very reasonable discussion to ask, but it's also one that's very hard to nail down with a deck with as much variance as Cyber-Stein. There's always the question like, well, are Cyber-Stein decks like, they can be very explosive, but are they actually consistent enough to win a tournament? And is my build the most optimal version of this Stein deck to potentially get me to win that tournament, right? Because people build Stein in different ways, and there's been a lot of theory going on into that. But I would still say that a lot of Stein decks that I see are not necessarily the most optimized. There are things that you can do to experiment with the ratios, experiment with, what ways you're triggering last will, or what ways you're, triggering other things as well. What bombs you have, what ways to clear away your opponent's defenses, things like that. And I do think that Stein is still relatively underexplored, because a lot of times people are more focused on figuring out how to beat Stein rather than figuring out how to optimize Stein further, which I think makes sense, because a lot of the times when people cook in these retro formats, they're trying to find new strategies that people didn't quite think of, or just new ways to play. And they don't necessarily want to just, focus on a slightly boring OTK deck. Like, I don't necessarily think Stein's boring, but a lot of people do view it that way. So I do think that it leads to an interesting sort of dynamic. And I will say that Stein is one of the most polarizing cards in the game's history, I think, especially in the retrosphere, for these formats, because like a lot of people really don't like Stein, and that's why a lot of people aren't playing Reaper format anymore, because the attendance of those tournaments has declined a lot after people ran around with Stein and were playing a lot of games with Stein. Even though Stein wasn't necessarily winning tournaments, it was still showing up in a lot of games, and people did not like that. So a lot of people have jumped ship from Reaper and don't play it anymore. And I do think that's a shame. I think Reaper is a very fun format in its own right, and I will be covering it on the channel very soon. So look forward to that if you're interested in that format. But it did sort of raise the question in my mind, and I know that this has been a long rambling talk, but this is the main thing that I want to talk about here. Does a deck necessarily have to be the best deck in a format to dominate the conversation about that format, right? As we discussed in Reaper, like, I will still say I think it's an open question as to what the best deck in something like Reaper format is, despite all the tournaments that have gone on. But I will say that, a fair amount of people think that Stein is not the 100% best deck in the format, or at very least, it's not tier 0. There are things that you can play to compete with Stein, and that's shown by the tournament results, right? But the reason why a lot of people left was because of Stein. So, even though you're having a deck that has never won a tournament, people are still playing it en masse because it's a very good deck. And even if it's not the best deck, it is the most dominant deck. It's the deck that people think of when they think of that format. So is that fair to Reaper format? Is that fair to Cyber format, right? We still don't know if Cyber-Stein OTK decks are the best decks in Cyber format either. Cyber format has things like BLS. BLS is a very big bomb. So maybe the typical Chaos Turbo deck that you'd find in GOAT format is actually the best deck in Cyber format as well. We don't quite know yet. There hasn't been enough experimentation to happen there. And when experimentation does happen in Cyber format, it often focuses on the decks that are different from GOAT format rather than the decks that are the same. So we don't quite know if, maybe it just is very similar to GOAT. It just has these more explosive, aggressive decks that, knock out some of the decks from the running in the format, but maybe it doesn't affect things like Chaos Turbo as much. We don't quite have the concrete answers to that. And, while I am personally of the opinion that Cyber-Stein probably is the best deck in Cyber format, because you've also got triple limiter removal running around, which you don't quite have in Reaper format, I do think it is still very much an open question. And it's a question that might never be answered, because I feel like whether Cyber-Stein is the best deck or not in Cyber format, it will still remain the dominant deck in Cyber format. The deck that everyone is afraid of facing, the deck that everyone techs out their decks to beat, and the deck that a lot of people will play because it is extremely, extremely powerful. But I know this was a bit of a rambling discussion and a bit less structured than my last discussion video, I think. But it's just because, like, I really do feel like there are a lot of interesting questions about Stein that are a bit tricky to talk about, because we're dealing in these unknown areas, because these formats are very underexplored. If you want to help explore them further, then you can head over to my Discord server, link in the description down below, and you can find games in Cyber format or any of the formats that I've featured on the channel. You can also join in the tournaments that we hold for these formats, which definitely helps in getting more data points for what decks may be the best or not the best. Also, if you enjoy this sort of retro content, definitely subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. I'd really like to reach 1,400 subscribers by the end of the month, and I think we can do it if you subscribe if you're not already. And also, if you want to support me directly, I have a Patreon as well. And if you join the Patreon, you get a shout out in these videos. So big shout outs to Taylor Compton, Rinswin, GeoMyFS, Dumptruck, Bread Knocker and Pork Chop Kun. It really means a lot that you all support me this way and motivates me to make more videos like this. Let me know what you think of the video down in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts on Cyber-Stein and the formats that he is present in, and whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing that he's so dominant, even if he isn't the best, or maybe you think he is the best. Let me know all your thoughts on this card down in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed as always, and until next time, I've been Ben from IGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.